we go. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Track Records with your hosts, Kenny and Barry Kuda. Last week, we were in the middle of discussing bands that have never released a bad album, bands that have released at least 6 records, not including live albums, compilations, greatest hits, that have released at least 6 albums and never did a bad one. We went over several bands. Today, we're going to be talking about, I think, more obscure bands that are on Barry's list. And we can just start there. So, Barry?
Yeah. Hey, Ken. So when we left off, I gave a list of bands that are somewhat more contemporary than the original ones we were talking about, who have, in my opinion, never put out a shitty record. Um, some of those bands were like Stereolab, Clinic, Broadcast, Tindersticks, PJ Harvey, Elbow, Kevin Morby, Juana Molina, and Air. So the reason I put these groups into their own category was I wasn't sure if you were overly familiar with them. In fact, I think you're probably not super familiar with most of them. So just wanted to, perhaps touch base on some of those bands if you're interested in hearing any more about any of them.
Yeah, although I guess that my first question would be most of the bands we touched on before that never put out a bad album put out also several good albums. And I wonder if there's a reason that bands like Elbow or Clinic aren't as well known. Like are any of their albums you would consider like outstanding albums?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Um, in fact, hence them being in this category,
Yeah.
you could grab any one of their records and like it, I think.
Okay.
Um, any of
Because
these bands that I
because
mentioned.
there are definitely bands who've put out pretty much like the same album over and over, and none of the albums are bad per se, but none of the albums are also particularly good per se, and that's not what we're talking about.
Not with these bands.
Okay. Yep.
There's some, of course, that are better than others.
Right. No, that
Um,
makes sense. Yeah.
but they, like, I have all of their records, all these bands, and I like them all and listen to them all on a regular basis, 24 hours a day.
And let me just stop here to say to our listeners that Barry has a record collection approaching Henry Rollins, and whereas I do all of my listening these days via streaming, and we will be debating that in a future podcast as a future podcast topic of records versus streaming. Going back to
Right.
you.
I certainly won't hold that against you
Yeah.
too much anyway.
Yes, well, we will
Um,
get into that.
let's just take someone like Juana Molina.
Okay.
Do you know who she is?
Nope.
Okay. She's an Argentinian woman and now in her early 60s. She's put out probably, I don't know, 8 records. Um, anyway, she was originally a comedian, apparently the most popular comedian in Argentina and through much of South America in the early 90s. And she dropped all that for her first love, which is music. And so she started this music career after being super successful as an entertainer in the TV and comedian comedy world. So kind of an unusual beginning for her. And her
Very.
records, how would I describe them? Well, she sings in whatever language they use in Argentina. I'm not sure if it's Spanish or Portuguese. It's one of those. She doesn't sing in English. And if I could describe her records and at least how they come across to me is the best Peter Gabriel records are what her records remind me of. They're not super straight rock or pop records. They have a lot of different elements with a lot of different textures, some electronic textures, also real instruments, but just a really unusual mix of elements. And my friend Arthur turned me on to
I
her a
was going
few
to
years
ask
ago.
actually how you discovered her. Okay.
Yeah, I'd
How'd he
never heard
find
of
her?
her. Just, the way we
Just
music
random.
freaks
Yep.
find out about
Got it.
great musicians,
Yep.
magazines, top friends, whatever. Um, but again, let me see, she's put out one, two, three, yeah, about 6, 7 records. Um, and they're all just super interesting, and they're the type of records that the more you listen to them, the more you get out of them, and you begin to appreciate them more and more with each listen, um, because they are so well done. It's the production's so interesting. Um, the fact that it's not English, I find interesting. Even knowing what I don't know what she's singing about,
Right.
but I still find it so compelling. And
Well,
I would, if you were to start exploring her catalog, I would just start with one of her most recent records and then work backwards. There's one called Halo from 2017, which I think is one of her very best. And then you could just work your way backwards to
okay.
her first record,
I
which
go.
sorry,
No, go.
oh, her first record per se came out in '96, and it was apparently a dismal failure. Uh, and she didn't put out anything again until 2003. So it was that 2003 record. I think it's called Segundo or Segundo. That's really where her career starts as we know her today,
But
is
didn't
with that
but didn't
record.
she in effect put out a bad record then?
I've I said I had all of her records.
Yeah.
I actually don't have that one,
Okay.
and I've heard that it's just different than
Okay.
what she ended up doing. It's not I have never heard that it's necessarily bad, but it was a commercial failure,
Got it. Right.
and
And there's a
so
difference. Yeah.
so it set her music career back for a while, and apparently she was being questioned as to how could you give up this great successful career as a TV star and star comedian for a basically a very unsuccessful music career.
Right.
But
That's interesting.
anyway,
And
she
I will say I was going to interject. I don't think the language makes a difference. One of the best concerts I ever saw during South by Southwest was a band from Spain called Amaral, and they put on just a phenomenal concert. I didn't understand a word they were singing, and it made no difference at all. So
yeah, good music is good music,
yeah,
and it translates languages, and it's really it's interesting to see how that works.
yeah.
And I know you're more of a lyric guy than I am anyway, but for you to um, not really care if you understand the lyrics, that's a stronger point than me, because the lyrics are typically my second focus. The actual music is what I tend to dial in on first and foremost.
Right.
And I think it's the other way around for you, right?
Absolutely, which is like why I like, Dylan, which is why I like the Dead, which is why I like a lot of artists. It's really the lyrics that hook me first.
Hmm.
But I mean, obviously both music and lyrics are critical, components. But I definitely get I'm more interested in bands with clever lyrics.
Like Weird Al Yankovic.
Yeah. That I've never liked that. For whatever reason, I don't like mixing comedy and music. It just doesn't work for me. Unless it's like a 30-second thing. But an actual career based on that is just does not do it for me. And let me actually I gotta take one moment to send out an apology to one of our listeners, because when I made a remark on our previous podcast about this person could be snooty about certain bands and certain artists, and he did correct me. And so shout out and apology to my brother Steve. um, it was not like that. And the reason, though, I was misremembering is because he did particularly listen to stuff like esoteric things like Per Ubu, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, like music for airports, and those sort of things. That was his focus. But he was not snobby. As a matter of fact, during the summer of 1978, anytime we were driving in the car, if the song Hopelessly Devoted to You came on the radio, he refused to go home until the song had finished playing. So just wanted to make that apology and then go back to the bands that you were talking about.
So Speaking of Weird Al Yankovic,
Yes.
I just don't get that whole fucking thing.
No, and I'll be
How there
snotty
was,
about that. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and the reason I say that and it's on my mind is because there was that biopic that came out last year about him, and I can't think of any musician or musical entity less deserving of a biopic than weird fucking Al Yankovic. You
It's a
kidding me?
it's the sort of like success you would have thought he would be like a 6 month thing and be like, okay, it's like everyone finds it amusing and interesting and funny for like 6 months, and then okay, everyone forgets he ever existed. But that wasn't the case. I don't know how
Uh,
many albums he released, but there were several.
and he had a huge fan base too,
Yeah,
clearly, because
yeah.
he kept releasing records and he kept having big hits. That was during the MTV era,
I was gonna say,
but
and MTV made a big difference. His career would not have been successful without MTV. Would be my prediction.
like the Buggles, um,
Yes.
and I didn't get it then, and I certainly don't get it now.
Yeah.
And it annoys me. In
It,
fact,
if you didn't get it then, you were certainly not going to get it now. Um,
well, going back to some of our earlier conversation, there was a lot of bands and artists back then that I didn't get and that I totally dismiss. That now
right.
I've
Okay. And
embraced
same.
them
Yep.
with a more open mind. I think
Yep.
ABBA was one of the ones we talked about,
Yep.
and there's a whole list of them. But man, I can't count Weird Al. It just annoys me. And there was such a huge push by the movie studio to get that movie in front of people, and I hope it failed
Well, there
miserably.
he also like they definitely, when he was recording records, they definitely promoted the hell out of him. And I think there I don't know how many thousands of bands or artists never made it because they weren't promoted, so no one heard their records.
Yeah, I can't
Yeah.
imagine that.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any personal experience with that, but but I mean, I'm sure there are some like just phenomenal like albums that I've never heard and never will hear.
Well, I think there's a lot of them on this recent list that
Yep.
they're in the middle of.
So
Air,
so of those people, which is the one where you would say, okay, this band really, their albums.
all of them,
Okay.
literally all of them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made this list. But
Okay.
there's a couple others on here that I think are worth mentioning
Go.
in the context of, are you familiar with them or do you want to check them out? Do you know the band Air?
And Air I've heard of, but I don't know them either.
As so as labeled on their very first record or first LP, um, it's subtitled "A French Band," Air, a
Yeah.
French band, and it was just a duo. And I guess you would consider it's certainly pop with a electronic uh, element to it, in the sense of not electronic dance music, but a lot of old school analog synths and things like that. And it's just super dreamy, is the only way I could describe them when they're at their best, especially their first record, which is called Moon Safari. That would be a place I would suggest you starting if you were interested in checking them out.
And when did that
Um,
come out?
that was 98, I
Okay.
believe. That just everything they did, I loved and just ate up. They put out maybe 6, 7 records. They stopped performing as a band, I think, in 2012. And the two main guys, and they are French guys, um, have continued to release records on their own since then. And they sound very much like Air Records, and I buy all those and love all those as well. But the records they put out while they were still Air are just really, really great. Um, I'd be curious to see what you thought of them. I don't know who I'd compare them to. I think early on they got that label of that space age bachelor pad lounge music thing that was so popular in the mid to late 90s. They got tagged with that label, but there's
Yeah.
so much more than that.
and I will definitely check them out. And this is where, and we again we'll get into this much more in a future podcast. But the great thing is, once we're done today, I will be able to just pop them up streaming wise and be able to listen. You know, and as opposed to having to go to a record store, purchase an album, you know, purchase the turntable, and and play it. But again, we'll get more into that later.
Do you know Kevin Morby?
And I know Kevin Morby because I think I've heard some of his music in films. Is that correct or not correct?
He did the soundtrack for a movie that came out, I think, a year or two ago called Montana Story.
Okay, maybe yeah,
And
that's what I
as
heard.
far as I know, that's the only
Okay,
soundtrack work he's done, and
okay,
it's super sparse and not very indicative
okay,
of his records.
okay,
I think he's another one of these artists on this list who I think you would probably really like.
okay. And so that's what someone else will check out too, because that is the whole point of this for all our listeners out there, and for myself as well, and for you, that we can all like find new music because that's what we want to do. So, and for him, record you'd recommend in particular?
City Music is the place I'd start,
Okay,
and his most recent record is called "This Is a Photograph," and there was a companion piece to that released last year called "More Photographs." You could start there as well. I would start with any of those three records.
which is that's amusing because I believe I may be wrong, but I believe there's a Mission of Burma song called "This Is Not a Photograph."
Yeah.
So those would have to be back to back on one of my mixtapes.
And safe to say, Kevin Morby does not sound like Mission of Burma at all. You
Got it.
couldn't, you wouldn't see them on the same bill. Morby has a real, at times, Velvet Underground influence, at times
Oh,
a
okay,
Dylan
okay.
influence, but
Where's he from?
Kansas, I
Oh,
believe.
interesting. Okay.
And he was in a band in New York City where he got his start. What was the name of that band? I think they were called they were called Woods.
Okay.
And also he was in a band called The Babies. That's where he got to start. And those were like Brooklyn based bands in the early
Right.
2000s. I've
Obviously not
never
the
heard
babies.
that's yeah,
Yeah.
I've never heard that stuff. And not BABY apostrophe
Right.
or S
Yeah.
BABIES.
Right.
That babies.
Yep.
Um I've never heard any of his work with those bands,
Yep.
but his solo stuff's really fantastic. I think you might like him.
It's interesting when I'll like hearing someone that I really like in a different band and being surprised how much I dislike that. For example, I'm a big Crooked Fingers fan. I really like Crooked Fingers quite a bit, but
Hmm.
Eric Bachman is the lead singer and writer, and yet his band Arches of Loaf, I totally dislike. The Pernice brothers, again, a big fan. Their previous incarnation is Scud Mountain Boys, I dislike,
Hmm.
and so it's interesting to me when I do listen to music that an artist from a different band, and I'm always surprised when it's like I don't like it.
Especially when the artist or band you don't like is the predominant singer and songwriter of the band, like Archers of Loaf.
Right, where it's the same guy in both bands, you know.
I'm not a huge Archers of Loaf guy either. I Their records were re-released over the last year or two. I picked one up really cheap, thinking, "Oh, I'll give it a try." Because, like you, I'm a big Crooked Fingers fan, and my very good friend Dov
Oh
played
yeah, right.
with Eric and Crooked Fingers for a long time. Um, and I didn't like the Archers of the Loaf record.
Yeah,
Or no,
it's
it was their reunion record that they put out last year.
okay.
That's what it was, or the year before. But anyway, I'm right there with you.
Which
That is interesting.
it's surprising because Dignity and Shame, the last Crooked Fingers album, is just such a fantastic album. I played it over and over to the point where I wore it out. And so I thought, oh, well, Arches of Love, it's like having more Crooked Fingers albums. It was not.
That's funny that wasn't their last record, by the way. They put out about three or four after that.
Oh, okay. I
But
was not
that
aware of that.
was speaking that record. It's interesting that that's the one that you single out because that's the main one that Dov plays on. Uh, that's when he was fully ensconced in the band and played There's a couple other records where he plays on a song or two, but that one he was a full-fledged member and played on the whole record, and
And did he?
that's when you saw him on that
I was
tour.
going to say at the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco. And so he was he touring with them as well?
Well, didn't you see them in Boston or New Orleans
I
somewhere? And
s-
you said you ran into my friend Dov.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That was in Boston.
That's what I thought. That's what I
Yeah,
remember anyway.
yeah,
And we were we were somewhat laughing about how you could barely even get a response out of him,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
You're like, "Hey,
Was
I'm a friend of Barry's."
yeah, which I thought would be, like he'd like flip out. And unless he was unbelievably stoned, it was not the expectation. It was not the response I was expecting.
Um, I've talked to him about that back in the day when it went down shortly thereafter, and was laughing about it with him. And he is he's not one to get overly excited about anything to begin with, but said he was also just super burnt out from a long tour, and just could barely muster up any sort of energy to act civil to people. It was nothing against you, just for
No,
the record.
it didn't bother me. It didn't offend me. I was just like, I really thought he'd go, oh wow, yeah, that's great, like or whatever. And he's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, because he's one of my best friends,
Yeah,
and
and it did not come across like that.
yeah.
Yes.
That
It
was
was one step away from Barry who.
I think I've heard of him.
Yeah,
I just I laugh anytime that comes up. It's kind of funny and sort of typical of Dob,
I did actually.
actually.
It's funny. I did actually again see Eric Bachman solo at they. Are you familiar with like these artists who do like neighborhood shows?
Yes,
And so he did
yes,
one of those, and it was guess I guess it
in
was.
Austin, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's just after COVID. I can't quite remember, but it was at a neighbor's house that was like a mile or two away. It was like they're like bring something to sit on, and it was like I don't know $5 or $10, and so I went there, and I was like basically sitting like a foot away from him on the floor, and that's about as close as I've ever been to an artist. And then was able to chat with him afterwards, because what I was talking to him about was at that show in San Francisco right after the show, which was fantastic. Kim and I were just hanging out, and the band was there, and they're like talking to fans and signing autographs, doing that sort of stuff. And a girl came up to Kim and I and said, "Hey, can I go touch him?" We're like, "Yeah, whatever." And she goes and like just like takes a running start and just slams her hands into Eric Bachman's back, sending him flying. And
Wow,
it was just this bizarre thing. And I was so when I ran into him and I was asking if he remembered that, he was saying it vaguely. But it was a bizarre scene.
that is. Another Crooked Fingers connection is during that era, Dov was in the band. Barb, who was the singer of
Yeah.
Spyglass,
Hmm.
she toured with Crooked Fingers during
Wow,
that
that's
that
interesting.
era as well,
And
and
did,
I think is on a record or two. But I know she toured with them for a long time.
and that was before Dov was there.
It was during that
Okay.
period.
Wow. So when you started Spyglass, like she
This was
knew.
after. This was after Spyglass.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah. Um, and another I don't know how long we want to spend on this topic, but
Yeah.
let me just say Stereolab, Clinic, Broadcast, those bands I all lump into one category really. And I don't know what I'd even call that category. They're quirky rock bands, very quirky. Yeah, I don't know how to describe them. Stereolab was certainly one of those bands at the forefront of that space age bachelor pad lounge music thing back in the 90s. I can't imagine they liked getting labeled as such, but I think Clinic and Broadcast also have a similar element where they don't really sound like anybody else, but they also sound like they have large record collections that have heavily influenced their music, going back to the 60s, and everything from then to now.
And
If
so
that makes any sense.
if there's a Clinic song you love, not an album but a song, what would it be?
I don't know the names of any of. their songs. I
And
really don't.
that's what
I
I was
know.
talking about earlier about, like, I think a lot of the albums you're talking about are albums where you like the album, you like the whole thing, but
Yeah.
there's not like a song or two that particularly leaps out.
Well, there is
Okay.
plenty. I just
Okay.
don't remember the titles.
Okay.
Um, most of the bands like that, whether it's Stereo Lab or Broadcast or Clinic, I definitely can say point to record the album titles, but the
Right.
song names never stick with me. They're usually somewhat obtuse and obscure, almost pretentious sounding
And so
titles.
some of that stuff, I think of stuff that I really enjoy listening to, but I listen to as more as background music,
Hmm.
as opposed to, like, one of the reasons I like lyrics is as opposed to songs you're singing along to that you can't even help singing along to. You know, like
Yeah,
if I'm listening to Springsteen, if I'm not singing along out loud, I'm certainly singing along in my head.
yeah. And it's pretty easy to remember titles like
Yes.
Badlands or
Yeah. Or
Thunder
back
Road.
streets. Yes.
Well, that's why that's when I say these bands have obtuse
Right.
song titles. The lyrics are as well,
Yep.
really obscure and just such a different thing.
Yep.
Um,
And so that's, and again, I like a lot of those, that sort of stuff, but again, it's the sort of stuff I'll put on like while I'm reading a book. It's
you
just,
you can listen to music while reading.
it depends on who it is. It depends on what
Hmm.
I'm reading, and it depends on who it is.
Yeah.
So,
Uh,
um,
what about when you're doing other things? Because I typically have music on all the time at home, not when I'm reading or watching a movie or something, of
yeah.
course, but uh, when I'm cooking dinner or eating, for example, my kitchen is set up right next to my main listening area in my house. So
Yep.
I always have music going on, and it's such a pleasure to have this setup. Are you the same?
And I have a similar setup where my home theater is my sound system, and it's in the main room, and it's right off my kitchen where where I'm doing the cooking. It depends. I definitely playing music a lot, um, and not as much as you. I've spent time at your house. I it's a different experience, and it's funny because with you, I remember when you lived outside Seattle and you'd leave the house, you'd leave the music on. That was like your security system. And for me, when I'm putting the dogs away so I can work with a client, I put music on for them. So
That's
that's
so nice of you.
well, it's also so they don't hear me working and
Yeah,
react to that. So
sure, sure.
so yes, I think Luna is definitely very tired of hearing the Grateful Dead, because that's what I usually put on for them. Uh,
Hopefully not their later stuff like Touch of Grey.
yeah, well, it's always just a random playlist, so
I
she has no choice. Yep.
I
But
kid.
yes, no. So when it starts playing and I don't know what it's going to play and it plays that, I just tell it skip ahead. And that's another thing about the streaming. I've got voice activation for whatever I want to listen to. I can listen to a song, I can listen to an album, I can create a playlist, I can tell it to raise the volume, lower the volume, skip ahead. And when you're cooking, that's a nice feature to not have to go to a turntable and change an album. But like I said, we'll really debate this in the future. So
I I it's not even for me, it's not even up for debate.
yep.
Um, I totally understand the convenience of streaming music, and I know you're a bit of a anomaly if you still listen to records or physical media of any kind. And I totally get it. It's just something I've never given up on. And it's
And,
like, well, I'll
and
just
I
keep
get it.
buying records.
Yeah, I was exactly like you once upon a time, and it was moving to several different times, several different cities, where I was like, okay, I went from albums to CDs. I was like, okay, these are easy to remove. To now, just okay, I've got to streamline my life. But I miss albums. I've bought a ton of albums because of the cover of the album, or because of something on the back of the record that got me interested in it. And so I do miss that. I miss record shopping. I really did enjoy it. Um, it's really just a question of convenience.
If you grew up when we did and you were a music fan, you bought records.
Yeah,
That's just
yeah.
that was it.
I,
And
I listened to the
there's
radio and I bought records. I don't do either of those things anymore.
yeah, yeah.
How often do you listen to the radio?
Never,
Okay,
never.
so
Yeah, if there was good radio stations, I
sure.
would when I was out drive. If I was out driving
Yeah.
and there was a good radio station where I live, which there certainly is not,
Yeah.
especially where I live now. My God,
Yeah.
no pun intended.
Yeah.
Um,
When I
but
lived
when
in
I,
New Orleans, WWOZ was a great station. It was a jazz station, and that's the last time I used to listen to the radio.
yeah, and I bet if you still lived in that area, there's probably still
Yeah, well, that it's still that station.
numerous good stations
If
there.
if you're driving and you're at a stoplight and cars are next to you, everyone is playing the same station. Everyone is playing WWOZ. Um,
And was that strictly jazz?
yeah, they might branch out a little bit, but no, for the most part, yeah, just jazz. But I learned
So,
a lot. So
going back to your comment about you got tired of moving records,
yeah,
um, you, you wouldn't want to move 95 boxes of records, 95 U-Haul boxes of records from one side of the country to basically the other side. You wouldn't want to do that.
see, right then is where I would have said I would have put out a little sign, huge sale.
And also to your point about having to, if you're cooking or doing something else, having to go stop the record, flip it over every 20 minutes. It's funny. I've had this argument with other friends, or not argument, but just conversation,
Yep.
and it's I actually kind of welcome that aspect of it because it keeps you engaged and also it keeps you moving. Like if you're sitting on a sofa
Yeah.
for however long, it's not good. We know this for health reasons. It's not good to sit behind a desk for 8 hours straight without moving. So I look at that as almost like, well, I have to get up, and even if it's just walking to the other side of the room, it's in theory beneficial.
Yeah.
But it
So
does keep you more engaged, at least me anyway.
yeah, no, it definitely does. And but when you own two dogs, you're not sitting at a desk for 8 hours. Let me just say,
Oh, I bet.
I'm rarely sitting at a desk for more than 10 minutes at a time. Uh,
Yeah,
but
because they're bugging you.
or because I need to take them out, or because something's going on. Yeah, or they're beating each other senseless. um, but no, I get that, and I always remember the Tom Petty disc where he goes, "This is the part where you go and turn over the album." That has stayed with me forever. So on one of his first CDs, if not his first CD. So
Um, I wanted to circle back to one of the bands we talked about last week,
mm,
as far as never putting out a bad record. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
oh, right, yeah,
So I had recommended a couple records to you, and I have to say, for the uninitiated, now I have a way different answer to that question now
okay,
because I watched this concert movie last week. It was a night or two after we last spoke. Just a second. Uh, a concert movie on Amazon. It's called Distant Sky,
okay,
and it came out in 2018. It was a straight up concert movie. The entire show, the single concert, recorded in 2017 in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I'm telling you, it blew my socks off. I've seen Nick and the Bad Seeds 5, 6 times, and when this movie came out, I thought, I've seen this already live so many times that I dismissed the movie. But I checked it out just the other night, and it was, if not the best concert movie I've seen, easily one of the best.
wow. And so
Just
still
so
available now.
compelling.
So
Sorry.
still available now on Amazon Prime.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
Distant Sky. Okay, gonna have to check that
It
out.
it really epitomizes why I like that band so much and why they're so good, why they are so unique. There's hardly any rock bands, and it's hard to even call them a rock band, but I guess what else do you call them,
Sure.
that play with that kind of taste, finesse, uh, restraint, and it really, really, I can't sing its praises highly enough. In fact, I wrote a review of it on my letterbox thing that I
All
started
right.
that I told you about.
Yeah.
So if you want to know more about that movie, go check that out because It does the movie more justice than I can do talking about it right now. And I would start there instead of with any record.
And that's a perfect place to begin. You get to see the band and hear them as well for a show that sounds very good. And Nick Cave's one of those artists who's definitely admired by a lot of other artists. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I will check that out this weekend. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing that.
It's
Most concert movies are middling to bad, so it'll be nice to watch
that's
a good one.
That's the thing, and
Yeah,
most of them have, like, 10 cuts per every 5 seconds,
yeah,
and they have to cut in a bunch of other shit that has nothing to do with the show because the band is not good enough to hold your attention.
yeah.
But this is so well done, and it's a tribute to how good Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds are, that it holds your attention, and at times, it many times, it was goosebump inducing for me.
Wow. Okay, that is high praise indeed. So yeah, no, I definitely want to check it out. And because it is, because seeing a good concert movie is a rarity, and so it's nice because there, I can't tell you how many times I've started one and 5 or 10 minutes in, I was like, okay, we're done, and I've just shut it off. So
Can you think of any other one that was really good off the top of your head?
stop making sense.
Yep.
Tremendous in the last waltz, although even the last waltz is broken up with a lot of other things. Okay,
Yes.
and
Yes.
so like I've often used to say, Scorsese did his best to ruin that concert.
Mhm.
But it still is still a great movie. And Stop Making Sense is phenomenal. I saw the Talking Heads on that tour, and so it also brings back memories from what I saw. um those are the ones that come to mind right away. I'm trying to think of other ones. uh I'm
There's
sorry.
gotta be others.